What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 25 of Facts on the Ground. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston, and today we are once again glad to have Morgan Artyukhina on the show. They are a journalist with Sputnik, and they've been working on a series of pieces regarding Space Force, which you may or may not have heard about. It's been in the news somewhat, but Morgan has covered it in quite some depth and given a really good history of how it's not a new entity. It's something that the US has been working on and weaponizing for a long time. So we're going to get into that today. Morgan, thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, okay, I'm actually really excited to talk about this because I feel like Space Force, when it has been in the media, has kind of been made into a joke, like, haha, Space Force, it's funny. But this is actually something that the United States has been working on for, quite some time. Can you kind of talk about the history of it, where this all sort of came from, and sort of the origin of this idea?
Yeah, well, so basically, as soon as, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, basically as soon as it was launched, the US began trying to figure out how to shoot it down. And that's really the beginning of this, and then so as the space race, everybody knows about like Gemini and Apollo, and Valentina Tereshkova and kind of, all of this, that aspect to the space race. What's really much less often talked about is the military side of it. And I mean, obviously, a lot of the NASA astronauts were Air Force, pilots and stuff like that. But there was really a very militant aspect to that too. That, as I have documented in some of these articles for Sputnik, talking about like the backstory here, has involved anti-satellite missiles, shooting nuclear weapons into space, like laser cannons, particle beams and stuff, stalker satellites, basically everything that now the US is pointing the finger at Russia and China and saying, well, they're doing all this stuff and this risks, extending military, conflict into space. And that's why we have to create the Space Force to defend our stuff. But really, the truth is that what the US is afraid of is losing its dominance in space. And they're pretty well aware of that. Like, there's no delusions among, the Pentagon elite and people in the US government. When you read the way they talk about this stuff and the documents they put out elaborating their doctrine, in terms of like, basically like, how do we understand what it means to control the space domain, and kind of what are our goals, what's our situation, where do we want to be and everything. The thing that they say is like, they have all of the typical stuff that you hear down here on Earth too, about like, we want to maintain freedom of, whatever, so everybody can do it. We want to defend, space for everybody. But they make it really clear that they aim to do that through dominance of space. And in doing that, it really makes it clear that it's like they want freedom for this stuff to happen, but according to their definition of freedom. And freedom, as far as the US rhetoric around the world and at home, has always meant the freedom for the US to do whatever it wants and not the freedom for other nations to do whatever they want. So that's really kind of the deal, here. I don't know if you guys want to take apart things one by one or whatever, but that's kind of the game, is basically that.
Well, I'm not sure how many people are aware of how long the history of the US trying to weaponize space is. So maybe we can go back to 1958 for a little bit and talk about when the US started detonating missiles and bombs in space, as well as in the South Pacific. And some of these tests or drills even involved destroying US satellites. They destroyed or we, if you want to put it that way, destroyed our own satellites in some of these tests. So can you talk about that when it really, this Space Force idea, this idea of weaponizing space really started to ramp up in the late 50s?
Yeah, so the thing is, back then, we didn't have ICBMs yet, right? We didn't have missiles that could hit the other side of the planet, from silos in Montana or whatever. It was really kind of a much more tactical sense. You had bombers that flew long distances to drop bombs, or you had shorter range missiles that could reach, maybe 1,000 miles, 500 miles, or something. Um, and so there was a lot of kind of novel ways, I guess, that they explored doing that. And one of those was an air-launched ballistic missile. And if you never heard of an ALBM before, it's because until very recently, they basically didn't exist. Like, the US tried to build one, couldn't figure it out, couldn't get the range long enough. Then the British picked it up, and then they didn't really have kind of the wherewithal to like fund it. That was called the Skybolt program. And then basically, by the time they were actually getting this device to work, was when they started inventing ICBMs. And ICBMs are the intercontinental ones. They're the ones that can reach around the world. And they basically made an ALBM obsolete. Why would you risk sending a bomber up to the edge of Soviet airspace when you can fire a missile from Montana? Or a submarine. They invented submarine ballistic missiles at the same time. They can sit literally anywhere. So there was that kind of became obsolete. Soviet Union was a couple of years behind the US, so they were never interested in an ALBM. They went straight for the ICBMs too. And so this technology kind of fell by the wayside. But in that gap when it was still, they still had this material, they were looking for other uses for it too. And one of those was, can we use this to shoot down satellites? Because the thing is, like, when you fire a ballistic missile, it goes up. It's called a ballistic missile because it follows a ballistic track, right? Like, if you were to fire a bullet up in the air at the same angle, it would follow the same track as a bullet. Like, that's just what things do under gravity. And so, in a sense, really all ballistic missiles are space weapons, because for a period they pass into space and then they come back down to hit their targets. Even a medium-range missile still goes several hundred miles up before coming back down to hit its target.
They can up to 750 miles, correct?
Yeah, 750 miles is usually the operational thing. But for example, like some recent tests a couple of years ago of like North Korean ballistic missiles, because they're really the main ones figuring out this technology right now. They did a test that shot a missile up to 3,000 miles up in the air. Now, that's just a test of capability. That's not like you wouldn't actually want to do that, but like that's, think about space technically begins at 62 miles up. The space shuttle low Earth orbit stuff is, maybe twice that up, maybe a little less. So that's kind of understanding this is the type of distances we're talking about here. So if you have a ballistic missile, then you have a space rocket. And actually, the rockets that were used, the Proton rocket for the Soviets, and now the Russians still use the Proton rocket, and like the Saturn V and all those missiles and stuff, all those rockets were converted basically from ICBM rockets. It's the same, literally the same thing. So that's kind of a big overlap between these two fields, is when they perfected ICBMs and they could perfect space rockets to put satellites into space or whatever, it also meant that they could turn those into weapons. And so, yeah, so really the first thing they thought about was, one, just launching, what if we launched a ballistic missile up, but instead of having it detonate when it comes down and hits its city down here, what if we just blow it up here in space? Some of these were just tests. We did a lot of blowing up nuclear weapons in the 50s, especially just to find out like what the hell is going to happen when you blow up a nuclear weapon here versus there. Like some of it was actually pretty interesting. Like the Soviets tested, could you bury a bunch of nuclear weapons and then blow them up and use that to excavate a canal? Like that. Like, so there was really kind of an honest attempt just to figure out what does this new massive explosive device make possible. The U.S. tested blowing them up underwater, tested striking, enemy fleet formations with it. So they were testing all kinds of stuff. One of the things they tested was an explosion in the upper atmosphere, or an explosion, exo-atmospheric, meaning in space. What does that do? Because there's no ground for the explosion to impact, and the electromagnetic pulse has a wide radius to kind of do, to do things. To cast mass disruptions of electronics and stuff, and so part of that became, can we use a nuclear weapon in space to disable or destroy a satellite? And so that was what they began testing. Some of these just involved shooting missiles at dud missiles, at satellites, and seeing how close can we get to it. So like you can judge like, okay, this passed 4 miles from this satellite. If it had a nuclear weapon that went off, we would have destroyed the satellite.
Mm-hmm.
Other times they did literally fire nuclear weapons into space and set them off in space just to see what would happen. How big is this explosive effect? How what is the radius? Things like that. Can we do it? So that was one way. The other way was that they used modified versions of ballistic missiles as ballistic missile interceptors. And this is where, Jesse, you mentioned in like the South Pacific, in some of the atolls down there, and like the Marshall Islands and stuff like that, that the U.S. acquired for testing purposes. They based some anti-ballistic missiles there. I think in the story, I particularly talk about the Nike Zeus missile. Mm-hmm. Which is a big ass missile, but they were like, well, maybe we can, instead of intercepting, because the idea is those would intercept a ballistic missile in flight. What if instead of if we can hit a ballistic missile moving, we can probably hit a satellite moving too? Probably a lot easier for a satellite, because a satellite follows the same track, it's going at the same speed. It's really very predictable doing that. So it's just kind of a matter of can you hit a little box the size of an SUV or so in space with a rocket traveling 25 times the speed of sound. And so that was the other half of that, was kind of repurposing that to shoot down satellites. So that's kind of the beginning of it. They tested and abandoned a lot of these things over the years. One of the more recent ones, before like the most recent in the 2000s to now, was in 1985, when they modified a different type of like nuclear strike missile, which was really kind of more, it wasn't really a cruise missile. It was just kind of like an air-to-ground missile that had a nuclear warhead. And they modified that to shoot down a satellite, and they actually did. And I have a photo of that, of an F-15 in what's called a zoom climb, which is where a plane in a zoom climb accelerates really at an altitude that it can go really, really fast, like supremely fast for like its capabilities as a plane. Accelerates really fast and then just kind of zoom up. So it uses its kind of momentum to give it extra speed. And then the F-15, fired it vertically. The photo is this plane is vertical, firing this missile up to hit a satellite. Which is a pretty,
by the way.
What's that?
That photo is terrifying, by the way.
It is.
It's a really, I saw it, I was like, I have to put this in the story. This is incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, he used that missile to shoot down a U.S. satellite that was like, I think its orbit was decaying or something like that. So it was kind of, so they blew it up, and it crashed back, what was left, I guess, kind of crashed back down to Earth, which actually brings up an interesting thing, because it's one of the many things that I was talking about. Like, the U.S. has already done this, and now it's faulting other nations for it. Like, China blew up one of its own satellites a couple of years ago, and the U.S. was like, what about space debris? What about all this stuff? It's endangering. But they didn't care when they were blowing up their own satellites. Now somebody else has the opportunity to do it, and nobody remembers the fact that the U.S., shot down its own satellite 30 years ago. So they can just kind of, just throw these mistruths out there. So
well, that's kind of something that I find fascinating, because when I'm reading through your pieces, which we'll link to all of those in the show notes, because all of these are truly fascinating. This is not stuff that they really are talking about in the news media. The space race ended long ago, and nobody really talks about it unless they are literally making a joke about it on, late night TV or whatever. But it's fascinating to me that it doesn't seem like anybody is all that concerned about any possible consequences or ramifications of blowing shit up in space. To me, that seems terrifying. What is this just basically a the nuclear powers trying to outdo each other again? Is that all this is, and they just don't really care? Or is anybody asking those questions, like, hey, what happens if this does cause space debris that then becomes a problem or whatever? I mean, what is this all about? Like, to me it seems nuts.
Well, in terms of the U.S. wants to maintain its dominance in space, and like, to use Donald Trump's words, space is the ultimate high ground. And for Russia, I mean, obviously Russia, used to be part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was, more or less on parity with the United States, really ahead of it in a lot of ways in terms of space, right? They put the first satellite in space, Sputnik 1. They put the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. They put the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. They did the first spacewalk, Alexander Leonov. They built the first like long duration space station. They put the first man-made object on the moon. I think they were the first to visit Venus with satellites, not with humans. You know what I mean? They did a lot of firsts,
right.
And the U.S. kind of swooped in the end with Apollo, put a man on the moon, and was kind of like, we won,
Right.
But the Soviet Union was really ahead of that, and then of course in 1991 the Soviet Union dissolved itself, and then throughout the 90s, Russia especially was really treated as a defeated nation, and in a lot of ways it was a defeated nation, and so it was really not a competitor for the United States in any major way. So really, its reemergence in the space sphere is definitely linked to its reemergence down here on Earth as a geopolitical force too. I don't even want to say it. I mean, it's beefed up its military since the 90s. In the 90s, the Russian government didn't have a budget really to support much of a military beyond its nuclear forces. But its budget still remains quite minuscule compared to the U.S., even compared to China's. But the U.S., obviously is far and above. It's as much as the next like 5 or 6 powers combined in terms of budgets, really even more if you include the nuclear budget, because the nuclear, this is another thing people really don't know about, the nuclear weapons budget is not included in the NDAA. It's not included in the Pentagon at all. All that is handled by the U.S. Department of Energy. So the $1 trillion nuclear weapons like refurbishment program that Obama began, that's been going on, it's going to go on for another 30 years. That project is a Department of Energy project, not a Pentagon project. But, so I mean, $734 billion, whatever it is appalling enough. But there's another, it's really closer to $1 trillion each year. Another 300 billion on top of that in terms of all the nuclear maintenance of the stockpiles, testing of weapons, testing of the missile, like all this stuff. They're actually right now in the process of like redoing a lot of the nuclear, because they're getting ready to replace the ICBMs, the Minuteman III ICBMs, which are the primary new intercontinental missile strike force the U.S. has. They're 50 years old, and they're replacing them. They're going to replace them in the next 10 years. They just handed out a contract for that a couple of weeks ago. So they're refurbishing the nuclear warheads that go on top of the Minuteman ICBMs.
Just to cut in, sorry, which company or companies won that contract? Do you know?
I want to say it was Northrop Grumman.
Okay.
But I don't remember off the top. I think it was Northrop. Well, actually, no. Northrop is building the new ICBMs. They were the one who got the contract for that. Who's doing the nuclear weapons? I don't remember.
I can look it up real quick.
I think it's being headed out by the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which is in California, which is one of the central U.S. Nuclear laboratories, named after 2 Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicists. But I I can't remember off the top of my head who's doing the nuclear.
Probably one of the usual suspects.
This says it was Northrop. Yeah. $13.3 billion contract for nuclear missiles. Is that what I'm looking for?
That's the missiles themselves. I think Jesse was asking about the warheads, which it would be
okay. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I looked up the wrong thing.
No, that $13 billion contract is for them to design the missile, the ground-based nuclear deterrent, I think is what it's called, strategic deterrent, ground-based strategic deterrent. So that's what that contract is. The nuclear thing, it actually might be a U.S. government thing. Now that I think about it, it's probably Los Alamos and Lawrence, the Livermore. Yeah, Lawrence Livermore, I think. I'm kind of getting names tangled up in my head, and everything sounds right when I say it. So,
yeah, every time I talk to somebody like you who has all of this stuff in their head, I'm always fascinated. Like Whitney Webb has the most incredible amount of acronyms stored in her head, and it's always amazing that she can keep it straight. So, good for you.
Yeah. So, it's probably, now that I think about it, it's almost certainly an internal U.S. government thing. They probably wouldn't contract out for a nuclear weapon itself.
Okay.
So, for the missiles, absolutely. And that's actually an interesting thing too to talk about in terms of Space Force, is how much of the design behind the Space Force is really aimed at a like public-private partnership thing, in using not just I mean obviously like Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or whoever you want to have are not actual branches of the U.S. government, right? They're not U.S. government agencies, although they basically are,
right?
You know what I mean? But but they're not. They're still separate. They're still companies, capitalist corporations that
on paper
kind of have their own laws of motion, right?
Right.
But the point is that there's always been this relationship with the military-industrial complex. But the way the Space Force is laid out, like their budget is. They're really leveraging what they're doing is, I'll give you an example, is SpaceX is a company that they're working really close with. And in terms of like one of the things the Space Force is going to do is it's for defending U.S. space assets, but it's also consolidated space assets. And I kind of need to explain this before I can say what I was just saying. Before Space Force, each branch of the military had its own space assets that it managed under its own agencies. There was one for Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, NSA, I think. Like everybody kind of had their own agency, and it was kind of a mess. A lot of stuff overlapped. They kind of handled it all very differently. So Space Force has consolidated all of that under a single kind of responsibility for everything happening in space. So that's kind of why that is. But another reason for this to exist is this kind of simplification, in the same way that like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence simplified, the reporting of national intelligence stuff a little bit. But in terms of like SpaceX, for example, the Space Force just handed out a contract to SpaceX to build the first couple nuclear ballistic missile early warning satellites. And that's something the U.S. has always had, to spot like the heat launches and kind of track the missiles and stuff. This time they want them to design them to detect hypersonic missiles, and I can explain why that's different if you want in a minute. But the point is, those satellites are going to be modified versions of SpaceX's Starlink satellites, which are used to provide close-in broadband internet access. So they're taking an existing satellite infrastructure and just kind of converting it from, this one use to another use, but it's the same really kind of thing. And they've actually talked about doing that a lot with like when they were kind of laying out like in the past 2 years or so, what do we want to do with the Space Force and how it's really going to function on a practical level. There's been a lot of that, like, let's take civilian stuff and figure out how to find a military purpose for it. In terms of well, they use SpaceX rockets, to lift stuff up. Some of it is just contracting out. Some of it is also repurposing, like these Starlink satellites, for example. And the Space Force is really looking at a really massive constellation of satellites to serve all kinds of functions of jamming, protection, communications, monitoring of various things down here, from communications to, the heat signatures of ballistic missile launches, to really everything that you can imagine might be emitted from Earth. Somebody might want to pick up and find out what's going on, spy satellites and everything. So that's really kind of something that the Space Force is really amplifying. And I think there's a purpose behind that too. And that's another reason for the Space Force is the U.S. is really at risk of losing the technological race for technological supremacy to China. And that's really where the Space Force, which came about really in 2018, it was created officially in December 2019, but really came about in 2018, came about in the same time as Trump really ramped up this trade war on China. They aim at the same thing, and that is to arrest or slow down China's race to become technologically supreme, because they have like a 30-year, like by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Revolution, they have it laid out like we're going to be supreme technological, whatever. They've put like tens of billions of dollars into building up their artificial intelligence industries and microchips, superconductor technology and stuff. So they've really, really put energy into that, and are actually already, I would say, ahead of the U.S. in some aspects of that. So both the Space Force is kind of designed to be a second Sputnik event, in that like Sputnik prompted this massive reinvestment in like the STEM fields in the U.S. and education and sponsoring of that, but also in terms of like research and really kind of the practical things you have to invent in order to, launch a new device of some kind. There was a lot of kind of satellite to, it's really actually really a bad word, related, technological developments that came out of, trying to figure out how do you make something as small as possible? How do you get something to work in low gravity or no gravity? How do you get it to survive radiation in space? All that stuff. There's all this other stuff that came about because of that. And really, I think that's a big part of what Space Force is also aimed at, is stopping China from doing that, while also jump-starting the U.S.'s AI and, kind of next-generation technology industries too.
So this is kind of, you think, in addition to being, kind of a grab for power, it's also sort of an attempt at a PR campaign to reinvigorate the kind of public interest in this sort of a thing? Is that kind of what you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way. I wasn't really kind of what I was getting at, but now that you say it, I agree. I think there is really a kind of drive to like get people on the side of like, pumping billions of dollars into this, because really, if there isn't
getting something out of it.
Right. Well, I mean, that's part. They haven't really talked about that kind of thing, but I guess people kind of like really, that comes really kind of more from, I guess, like the commentators and stuff, people who point out, like this would have a utility down here, but yeah, I definitely think there is an attempt to kind of build up, excuse me, to kind of build up a case for supporting this. And I mean, national defense has always been a great way for American presidents and American governments to get widespread public support for something. Claim that somebody else poses a threat to you, and we have to do this thing in order to avert that threat, protect our way of life, American democracy, blah, blah, blah. Then you can get people behind, figuring out how to build a particle beam in space.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
And I think the reason why I kind of likened it to a PR campaign is because in one of your articles, there's the ad that they have that's very Star Trek. They're trying to make it seem very cool and very hip, and so that, to me, that's I got like marketing campaign. Like they're trying to make this something that the American public is going to get behind and be willing to spend money on. So that's kind of why I kind of hearkened it to a PR campaign. That's kind of what it feels like a little.
I mean, I think that's very true, especially in terms of recruiting, because across the board, the U.S. military is not recruiting the numbers that it aims to every year. And it's kind of a disaster for them in many ways. But yeah, no, there is definitely, who doesn't want to, fly a spaceship and shoot lasers? You know what I mean? I mean, like, I grew up playing X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. You know what I mean? That'd be fucking great. But you know what I mean? So, like, there is definitely, especially in that ad, that recruiting ad, a very real attempt to appeal. But, the thing is, they do that all the time, too, right? Like, with the Army and the Navy and stuff. But I guess there's something, like, just not quite as cool as space. Like, space has always been cool. Even before we were able to go to space, space was cool. So, yeah, there is definitely, I think that's really more of a convergence. Like, I don't think they picked space because it'll be easier to market. I think it's just they want to do this thing in space, and here's a way to spin that,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's where the fight is going. So, I mean, they're just trying to attempt to, build a PR campaign around that will make that their agenda work for them, I think. So, it's what they always do.
Right.
And you mentioned in the article that contains that dystopian PR video that there essentially is no opportunity to join Space Force at this time, or very limited opportunities. So people who think they're signing up and are going to be launching into space to work on some noble new frontier it's a pipe dream at this point.
Yeah, most of Space Force, Space Force has no people in space. You join Space Force, you will almost certainly be working underneath a mile of mountain somewhere near Denver. That's the way it is right now. And someday they say that they will be putting people in space. I mean, obviously someday, they want to build a moon base, they want to build a Mars base, they want to, do whatever kind of thing. But yeah, for now, I mean, the thing is, they're still really getting Space Force up and running. Like, it was only actually created as a separate branch in December, and they started transferring people over from other branches who wanted to join. But they don't even have these units really kind of formally like stood up yet. So it's really still very much in formation. But yeah, you're not going to space if you join the Space Force. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be watching satellites, and you're going to be like, the offensive weapons they have right now are ground based jammers that would aim to jam enemy satellites, and they've built a couple of those systems. That's really the primary offensive thing right now that they're really kind of looking at.
I'm kind of curious, like, about the recruitment aspect. It seems like, being recruited into the Space Force would require, a particular level of skill. So are they going to be recruiting, from the Air Force, from NASA, or are they going to be recruiting from the general population of people who may just want to join? Do you know how that's going to work, or what they've said about that?
Well, the Space Force is a part of the Department of the Air Force in the same way that the Marine Corps is a part of the Department of the Navy. So Air Force had a lot of these responsibilities already. They had U.S. Space Command, for example. So that stuff's really been kind of transferred over. I think Air Force probably got the first pick of it. I imagine someday they'll recruit from the general public. Yeah, definitely. But
yeah, I feel like, flying out into space requires a certain level of knowledge already.
Yeah, they're reorganizing all the space assets they already had, because the U.S. has very significant space assets just scattered across half a dozen different agencies, in the Pentagon and intelligence. So it's a lot of the Space Force is really just kind of consolidating that for now.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And when you're talking about how there isn't really a lot, you're not going out in space right now. There was one of the articles that you wrote where you were talking about how they now have a new facility where they can go out and test all of these space structures. It's like this new lab. Is that kind of where they're at in the game plan right now? It really seems like it's like bare bones, like newborn baby. We're really just trying to figure our shit out at this point. Can you talk a little bit about like these labs that they're developing and what they're doing at these labs?
Yeah, so the deal, I mean, this lab is really, and I actually kind of now that I realize that I forgot to mention this in the piece, NASA has an almost identical lab. Because they have to be able to test out things before they put them in space, make sure it'll tolerate stresses, heat stresses, pressure, radiation, whatever the case may be. Just the stresses of being launched on a rocket, up into space are pretty extraordinary. But yeah, so this is really just kind of they're developing their own infrastructure for that. They can test new materials, they can test out stuff like that. One of the things is giving an idea of because it's not just satellites, it'll be other, they refer to it as space structures is the word that they use, which is kind of interesting because it really kind of speaks to the larger volume. It's not just going to be satellites, it's going to be space stations at some point, it's going to be probably space weapons, or one of the things I talked about in that article is a device, which, tell me this isn't some SimCity 2000 shit. It's going to be a solar collector in space that's going to use microwave, waves or whatever to beam its energy that it collects from the sun down to Earth to some, in this case, to forward operating bases, to U.S. military installations that are set up on the front lines, that can't bring their own power, plants with them or whatever. Because the military has portable power plants on trucks and shit. But you could be able to beam, power down there that would be able to use to run radar stations, missiles, toilets, whatever have you. These kind of frontline installations and stuff. So that's actually one of the things that they're testing in this facility once it gets up and running. It just opened a couple weeks ago, but that's one of the things they'll be building there is this space solar collector, So, and that's the thing, is on its face, that's really cool, that is some really cool stuff. And then you find out, it's going to be a military thing. We're not going to benefit from that. We don't benefit from any of this,
Right. This is intergalactic imperialism. It's terrifying. It's really scary.
So
yeah.
The United States military having this kind of power and being able to, wield this sort of weaponry is not something that I'm excited about. It's a little scary, for sure.
And the colossal amount of money that's being put into this, especially now, while there's a pandemic, for 99% of Americans, they're stuck in financial dire straits, essentially, that the government and related entities like Northrop Grumman are getting paid by us, essentially, to play with these insanely expensive war toys. It's very grotesque when you think about it at its essence like that. And again, as we've been pointing out, we as people, as citizens, if you will, we get nothing from this. It's not helping to create renewable energy or anything positive along those lines, for example. But it somehow still takes hold in the public consciousness that this is something we need, and it makes me wonder how much of that has to do with this relatively long history of the U.S. pursuing these weapons. So just to go back a little bit before we come back to the present, I wanted to ask you about a few precedents to Space Force and the weapons they're testing and manufacturing now. In one of your articles, you talk about the U.S. Prowler, which is an inspector satellite. Can you talk about that a little bit? And then can you talk as well about Project Thor, which seems like it's making a comeback?
Well, it might be. That was kind of the question that I raised.
Right.
All right. Well, Project Thor is a whole animal, so I'll answer the other one first. The Inspector satellite. So the fun thing about the Inspector satellite is that basically it's not illegal to put your satellite next to somebody else's satellite. It's dangerous. It's kind of dumb, but like it's not illegal. And the idea was okay. So the thing is, the Prowler program was really secret at the time, and we only kind of later found out about it. And it was kind of a test too, basically just to kind of figure out like, could you maneuver a satellite this much? Because typically, once you get your satellite into orbit, you know, it's it's got like an orbit. You know what I mean? Like it kind of got its path. It orbits. You know, most satellites don't. So some satellites orbit. They stay the same altitude above, and they kind of pass around. Some are on oblong orbits. You know, they get closer, they get further away. And then some satellites are geosynchronous, and they're actually the furthest ones out. They orbit at the same speed that the Earth turns, so they're always over the same space. Those are like GPS satellites. They're actually like way the fuck out there. They're like 25,000 miles up, which is just crazy out there.
Yeah, once again, sorry to interrupt, but when you read these pieces and start looking at the distances that even just an ICBM can achieve altitude-wise, 750 miles on average, let's say, it's terrifying that there are these machines and weaponry out there. It's
with that kind of capability. Yeah.
It's not enough that the U.S. has military bases and forces on almost the whole planet.
Everywhere.
Yeah. Even 25,000 miles out, we're trying to occupy. And I encourage everybody who's watching to read Morgan's pieces, because not only are they very interesting historically and with regard to what's happening now, but they will terrify you, but in a good way that makes you aware of what's happening.
To give you an idea of the altitudes, so you were talking about ballistic missiles on average reach 750 miles up. So the International Space Station, I just looked it up, 254 miles up. So you could be at the ISS and watch a nuclear missile fly past your window.
Yeah.
And then it's coming back down the other side. But
right.
So you know what I mean? That's really kind of the way that this works. And it's kind of funny because that's actually the way that hypersonic weapons work. Is every rocket that goes into space passes the hypersonic threshold. The hypersonic threshold is Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound. Your average rocket to, escape the Earth's gravity and get up there hits about Mach 25. It's going. It's fast. and so every ballistic missile does that. So every ballistic missile is technically hypersonic. The deal with the hypersonic weapons, and hypersonic weapons are a big part of this too, because hypersonic weapons are so hard to find. There's actually 2 types of hypersonic weapons right now. One is a hypersonic glide vehicle, which is it's very similar to a ballistic missile in many ways. A ballistic missile. Let's talk about well, let's just use the US's Minuteman III ICBM, right? It goes up and it's like a normal rocket. Like it blasts up, it kind of sheds the parts as it gets further up, and then it gets up, and the nose cone pops off. And if it was carrying a satellite, that was when the satellite would be like kind of released. Mm-hmm. But if it's carrying a 175 kiloton nuclear warhead, that warhead detaches. And there's usually other things on there too. There are decoys and stuff, because enemy interceptors will attempt to shoot down or detect, where is this going to go. So there's kind of decoys and like fake warheads and stuff and whatever. Some missiles can actually even carry multiple warheads. So each warhead would go hit a different target, which is just insanity all in its own. Those are called MIRV warheads. And actually the US used to have its well, actually I won't get into that. The point is, that they exist. And then this little, smaller warhead, reentry vehicle would come back down and hit its target. The hypersonic glide vehicle uses that momentum, and then it can maneuver. It's a glide, so it can glide, and so it uses that Mach 20, Mach 10 speed of like re-entering to go really fucking fast where it's going. And the thing is, it's when you think about like I realize I'm jumping around. I will get there in the end. It will all assemble. You have like a satellite that's job is to look for ballistic missile launches, right? There's a flash. There's an enormous heat signature as it blasts up for several minutes. So you've got that, and you can kind of figure out, through physics equation, it's on this, angle. So we know where it's going. There's really only one place that it's really going, and that's how you can shoot it down, or figure out where it's going, sound the alarm, whatever. Hypersonic rockets only fire for a very short amount of time before they drop their vehicle. They get the speed that you need to escape, but then they put that speed into like a more direct like strike weapon. So so it makes them much harder to track, because once the glide vehicle separates from the rocket, there's no engine burning. It's all going on its own momentum, its own speed, as gravity pulls it down and it maneuvers its way down. So you can't track it with traditional ballistic missile tracking satellites. And so Russia was the first one to introduce a hypersonic weapon, which is the Avangard.
And there's no heat signature to what's released?
Not that you can tell. There is in the abstract. It's going very fast against the atmosphere. But
right.
You have to remember, a satellite up on Earth, above the Earth, is looking down at the Earth. So there's all the background heat and stuff like that that it has to sort through in order to find this thing, that's going. So that's really hard, and that's really why they want to build these new satellites to detect these hypersonic weapons that are really undetectable and right now probably unshoot downable. Like you remember a couple of years ago, like Russia put out this video of their Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle like nuking Florida basically, and like the whole thing was like Putin was like, you can't intercept it, you can't stop it, because the thing is, not only is it going really fast and you can't find it, if you did find it and shoot at it, it can maneuver. That's the other thing about these things, is it's not just going in a straight line. It can maneuver. It can go around up and down, side to side, and dodge things you shoot at it, or even dodge your ability to predict where it's going next. And that's what really makes it really dangerous.
And that technology is built into it. It's not. There's not somebody sitting in a hangar outside of Las Vegas who's controlling this. This technology is built into it.
I believe that's correct. Yeah, like it's programmed to make random course changes. It's still going to the same target. It can't pick a new target, but like it can decide how it's going to get there. That's my understanding. There's not a person flying it.
Okay.
The other type of hypersonic weapon is a hypersonic cruise missile, which is just a really fucking fast missile. Those don't leave the atmosphere. Those are cruise missiles. They stay low and they just they go. So Russia has both. China probably has both. The U.S. has neither. The U.S. is really behind on that too. So which is again another part of this big like next generation weapons investment drive, by the Pentagon, is we have to compete, whatever. Well, right. You know why the U.S. has to compete? It's because the U.S. has 6,000 nuclear weapons. China has 300. Like talk about China as a threat to the U.S. China has just enough nuclear weapons to deter an attack against it, and that's it.
Right.
So the notion that China poses a nuclear threat to the United States is laughably stupid. Russia, of course, has as many weapons as the U.S. Does, but then again, Russia's not asserting its power in 800 military bases around the world. You know what I mean? So, like, countries that are kind of, behind the US are going to develop novel ways to catch up and compete and make themselves a threat to the bigger power. So you could really say in a way that the US is kind of provoking these nations into researching and developing new technologies to try and get the upper leg on the US, which, you know, has 3 different ways to deliver nuclear weapons to its target. And, you know, has this threat of satellites in orbit and whatever to
So the U.S.
really threaten
doesn't
anybody.
the U.S. doesn't possess any hypersonic weapons at this point?
It does not.
Okay.
There are several in testing, but the U.S. is really behind the 8 ball in hypersonic weapons. They've done some research in like X planes in terms of like trying to get them to go fast or whatever, but no, they're actually really, really behind on hypersonic weapons. In fact, back in April or March, maybe, Trump gave an executive order. He actually used the Defense Production Act to redirect resources towards building materials and the technology and the research and stuff into closing the hypersonic weapons gap.
Yeah, I find that kind of fascinating, given how much we spend on our military, that we're so far behind. And maybe it is that it's, you know, it's an intentional thing so that we can, you know, provoke these other countries to do these things so that then we don't look like we're the ones developing these things. It's like, oh, well, we have to keep up. And it's just really strange to me that as we spend so much money on our military, and to be that far behind on something, you know, so advanced is just really strange to me.
I think it's really more that the U.S. was kind of resting on its laurels. The U.S. has far and away the ability to annihilate anything it wants to. And so why would it research new ways to do that when the existing ways will suffice? You know, I think it's probably the attitude, because the U.S. already, you know, I mean, it has a huge budget and it spends so much money, but what's kind of weird is that inside of that budget, there is really fierce competition to win every little dollar that you can for all these programs, to trim things here and there, to like kind of create, you know, and so there's actually a lot of competition in terms of like what ships are going to get built, what programs are going to get expanded, what are you going to use this, you know, device for or whatever. You know, what ships are going to be. I read a lot about Navy, so that's why I say ships a lot, but like bombers, for example. Like, are you going to spend money to refurbish these bombers and extend their life for another 20 years? Or are you going to put money into like inventing an entirely new type of bomber? And increasingly, the U.S. has been extending the service life of its old stuff. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the U.S. had some really, really advanced stuff because it was competing with the Soviet Union. There was this direct competition. If the U.S. didn't develop the most advanced thing, the Soviets were going to do it. After that, you know, the U.S. in the 90s became the sole superpower. Nobody else was close. So it was kind of like, that's when they started building the Joint Strike Fighter. That's when they started building the F-22. And those are really the only 2 warplanes that the U.S. has put energy into building for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Because
there's been
the F-35, I believe it is notoriously,
that's a massive money pit. It's horrible.
A notoriously shit plane if you're looking at
ineffective. It can't fly at night or in the rain or it's, yeah.
Ironically, it's called lightning, but it can't get hit by lightning.
Yeah.
And that's a good example. Things break on that, and it's like, oh well, how could they let their advanced aircraft, you know, have this kind of like laughably like simplistic, you know, problem to it? And it's like, it's like, do we want to spend the money to fix it, or is it still good enough? You know, and that thinking actually really permeates the U.S. military in a lot of ways, and so yeah, so a lot of their equipment is really aging because when they built it, it was top of the line 30, 40, 50 years ago, but it still does its job fine today. So it's like, well, we'll just pay money to put new engines in it. You know, we'll pay money to fix them up, and we'll extend the, you know, like the B-52 first flew in 52 was when it first flew, maybe, or 58, I don't remember. And they're planning on using that into the 2050s, you know? So they're extending that. They're extending like the B-1. They're extending the use of the length of like the Arleigh Burke class destroyers, you know, which are already 30 years old, because it's more trouble and it's more energy to build a new system, but the one they have is already still superior to what everybody else has. And so there is kind of a little bit of room in that for like innovation, I guess, which is innovation by adversaries to the US, which is how China can, for example, pump a lot of money into hypersonic weapons or into like intermediate range missiles. And so now they have hypersonic weapons. They have ultra long range anti-ship missiles that can actually hit US warships from beyond their radar ranges, that the US would just never even see them coming. And so they've been able to concentrate on these certain areas to kind of create a deterrent. Every other country other than the United States is really looking at deterrent. How do we deter the US from, harassing our ships in the South China Sea? How do we deter them from, bullying us with economic sanctions? How do we deter them from, carrying out airstrikes against us? And so you come up with like Iran, for example, has nuclear missiles that are buried, or not, excuse me, Iran does not have Iran has ballistic missiles that are buried in the ground that you don't know where they are, and they just blast through the fucking ground to take off. Like they've built that, and that's actually kind of cool. They have like underground missile cities along the Iranian coast that will be able to like hit U.S. ships when there's a war. Like they've had to innovate this stuff.
And I always
North
say
Korea has some cool technology too, but like they built that as a deterrent, as novel ways to kind of try and close the gap with the U.S. So
I was just going to say that I always say to people who cheerlead to some degree a war or conflict with Iran, I suppose there already is a conflict since the US has been leveling deadly, even genocidal sanctions, one could say, against Iran. But I say to those people who cheerlead such a standoff that they should read history, especially about the Iran-Iraq War, and see how resilient, I don't know if that's the right word, because I don't want to cheerlead war here. And
I think that people are just heavily underestimating Iran.
Yeah, they are very, and I mean this in a good way, they're very tenacious people, and they will fight to the death if they have to. And I don't think that there are very many Americans who want to do that at this point in history. And I tell people, don't underestimate Iran. If you look at how brutally they fought and were brutalized in the Iran-Iraq War, I think it's a perfect case example of how much they're willing to fight to defend and protect themselves. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There were things that were done in the Iran-Iraq War by Iran that I find completely reprehensible, such as sending children on motorcycles to ride through the minefields to detonate them so the army, the military, could advance. Other examples, but that's a different point. Point being that, again, they are very tenacious people and they will fight to the death. And I don't think that many people in the US, especially in the US military, have that. I don't know if they're not aware of that, but they certainly don't have that capacity. Don't think Americans are fight to the death sort of people anymore, despite all the rhetoric we hear nonstop.
I think especially when people, I'm sorry, go ahead, Misty.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, what people, to kind of talk about Iran for a minute, I think what people miss about Iran is that the Iranian government, people kind of look at, its repressive aspects and stuff. And I mean, I'm a queer person. It's not, the country is not known for its kindness to gay people. Although they do actually have an interestingly progressive law specifically concerning transgender women, which is that the government will pay for your transition, including gender affirmation surgery. Iran does the second largest number of gender affirmation surgeries for trans women each year, outpaced only by Thailand.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, it's, you know,
Oh.
it's,
Oh.
the way I understand it is that it's like, it's based on like the old school logic that like the US had about like the why transsexuals transitioned, which was this idea that like we were ultra gay men who wanted to like transition so we could enter straight relationships again. And so that's kind of the way that like the Iranian government looks at it, is like being gay is a sin, but like if you're really a woman, then you should become a woman and be allowed to exist as a woman to avoid that sin. And that's kind of the way they look at it. There's actually a really interesting story about this trans woman whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, who actually snuck into Ayatollah Khomeini's house and confronted him about like, this is our plight, you know? And he was like personally moved by this situation that he was like not aware of. And that was where those laws really came from.
What year
That's fascinating.
No, I don't.
It was Khomeini, not Hamini.
Yeah, it was Khomeini. This was back, I think it was in the 80s probably.
Yeah.
Because he died in what, like 92, I think. So yeah, it would have been during that time, but it was Khomeini. I can't remember that woman's name off the top of my head. But yes, they have a weird, not to get on too big of a divergence, because obviously, formally at least, there is the death penalty for sodomy there. Although I'm not aware of it actually being enforced. I think it's there as a scary deterrent. It's not the point. The point is that the government is a very nationalist government, right? The Iranian Revolution was a nationalist revolution. It was a revolution against a monarchy that was put in power by the U.S. and the U.K., that was very much an agent of the U.S. and the U.K., and it was very much a reclaiming of national sovereignty, going all the way back to like really like the late 19th century, when you had like Imperial Russia and the United Kingdom competing for like spheres of influence and like forcing economic concessions from the I guess it was the Qajar monarchy at that time, and really going all the way back to that time. There was this kind of imposition of foreign powers in a similar way to the way that like China was. Like the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Revolution, was really in its own way a kind of nationalism. There's a nationalist side to that, which was like the whole China has stood up side. China's marching under its own 2 feet. It's not subservient to the Western imperialist powers anymore, or Japan as an imperialist power anymore. And so there's kind of this nation building aspect to Chinese socialism that is a really potent uniting force in China. A lot of people who don't necessarily like the socialist aspects like the idea of China not having to bend to the will of other countries. So they kind of have that support. The Iranian Revolution has the same thing. Not a lot of people necessarily like the idea of like some of the religious rules or whatever, but they don't want to see their country dominated by Western powers. They don't want to see it subservient. They don't want to see it, reduced to, being forced to import Western goods, or whatever. Iran produces a lot on its own in terms of research, in terms of technology, in terms of goods and all this stuff. And if they didn't have, economic sanctions against them, they'd be able to do that a whole lot more, So there is a real element of national pride in behind the Iranian Revolution that actually trumps discarding of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, really accelerated, because now every single thing that goes wrong in Iran is blamed on the United States. You know what I mean? And a lot of it is the fault of the United States, but a lot of it is also the fault of the Iranian. Not every government is perfect. Every government makes mistakes. Every government has its own priorities. They have a nationalist priority, and all of that too. And there's no doubt to that. But like, that's also kind of true across the board. But so the point is that like, to the point of like your tenacity, the tenacity point, in the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq invaded Iran. They tried to seize the Khuzestan province, which had it was primarily Arab speakers, Arab mostly Arab people, and so Saddam's thinking was like, well, they'll rise up and join us and whatever. They didn't count on like, oh yeah, they're Arabs, but they're Arab Iranians, you know. So there was a real nationalist side to that was totally underestimated by Hussein, and I mean that war was a nightmare catastrophe in so many ways for both countries.
Yeah.
It was really, I mean, there's just so much to that war. Nuclear, and I keep saying nuclear. Iran, or both countries at times had nuclear weapons programs during that war. There was also chemical weapons, gas, In
fact, Khomeini did not want anything to do with nuclear weaponry. It was only after Saddam used Western-provided chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers that he, I don't know if gave permission is the right phrase, but that's when Iran became interested in a deterrent capacity, was after Saddam. Yeah, he gassed the Kurds in Halabja, but he also used it against Iranian troops on the field, and it was something that hadn't been seen on that level since, I would say, World War I, perhaps. That's just
Go ahead. When I was a history teacher, I taught about the Iran-Iraq War and the Eritrean War as like World War I redux. Like it's the same stuff. Like trench warfare, human wave assaults, tank, attacks. Like it's in many ways. There's a lot of bombing of Iranian cities and Iraqi cities, especially Iranian cities. Saddam really tried to expand it into a total war footing and bombed more than a dozen Iranian cities directly.
And what's I'd like to keep going with this, but just to interject, because I think it's a grotesque irony to Bush Jr. flying in and declaring mission accomplished in, what was that, May 2003?
Yeah.
At the start of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam boasted that it was going to be a whirlwind war and that it was going to be over like that because Iraq would trounce Iran. And I think the parallels there, especially given the two figures, Bush Jr. and Saddam Hussein, it's one of those grotesque historic ironies, I think. Mm-hmm. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, nobody gets involved in a war they think is going to take a long time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hitler thought he would be in Moscow before Christmas. Shit like that. I mean, World War I, they thought that would be solved. They're like, we'll be home by Christmas, with what they said. So,
I don't know. I think the United States is very much interested in war that lasts forever right now. Like that's their thing. That's our thing. We're very much interested in endless conflict. I mean, we're still in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's absurd, but that's just mostly feeding the military-industrial complex machine. That's just feeding the beast. That's a necessary war in order to make contractors money, I think. So, but that's a whole nother level of bullshit.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the almost complete denuding of the U.S.'s manufacturing base. I've said this in other episodes. What does the U.S. manufacture anymore besides weapons and pharmaceuticals, perhaps? But the problem is that, okay, the people who work for those companies, they have jobs, they get paid, the companies make money, but again, nothing is being transferred to any public good, or there's no public benefit from the manufacturing of this.
Whereas, and in fact, quite the opposite. I mean, people say that this is a national security issue and it's to keep us safe, and it does the opposite. It doesn't keep us safe. This stuff doesn't keep us safe. It pisses people off and it makes us enemies, and those enemies will eventually come for us. I mean, we've seen that already. So it's this, hamster wheel of nonsense where we just keep trying to convince ourselves that we have to do this in order to keep ourselves safe. And that's the lie that we sell to the American people. But I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, this is really just about making. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
I don't even remember now, honestly.
I mean,
ramble
that's a
sometimes.
whole mood. I understand that, but I was gonna say that brings us back to the Space Force.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, I mean, as just the latest iteration of U.S. imperialism, you know, yeah, maybe someday they'll use that solar-powered space, you know, that space solar collector to power Los Angeles or something, you know, but like it will have been developed to like, you know, power, you know, I don't know, forward bases on islands in the South China Sea that the U.S. seizes from China in some future war. You know what I mean? Which is really, at this point, is the U.S.'s primary concern. Everything they're doing in foreign policy is aimed at consolidating forces against China for a future war. Space Force is another aspect of that. And that's really, I think, to talk about space dominance, why the U.S. has pulled out of this Treaty on Open Skies. Are you guys familiar with this at all?
I've heard of it. If you could explain it, though, that would be fantastic.
So in 1993 or 94, I think, the U.S. and Russia and a bunch of their allies signed this Treaty on Open Skies. And what it did was it established very, very specific protocols for allowing overflights of the other side's territory with specialized spy planes. It was just to kind of show that we're not planning anything threatening. We're not planning a sneak attack. You know, you can fly over. And the treaty outlines very, very specific like sensors that are allowed to be on these planes. The planes have to be certified by the other side before they can fly. They have to say where they're going to fly and stuff like that. And, you know, mostly so that they don't fly through like an enemy like military drill or something like that. But like this was all designed to lower tensions, to show, so that, you know what I mean? Like if you can fly,
like if you show me yours, I'll show you mine.
Exactly, right? You know, I mean, there's a Russian expression, doveryaй no poveryaй, trust but verify,
right.
Which is the same principle. It's to just relax. And for the U.S. and Russia, it's good, but it's also like other countries that are party to it. For example, Georgia, the country of Georgia, Georgia, has a right to fly over parts of Russia. You know, and so they can do that and, you know, and maybe see like, okay, they're not planning a sneak attack against us on the other side of the mountains or whatever, you know, we can kind of all rest, you know, easy or whatever. It's that kind of thing too. Any country has the right in the treaty to overfly any other country in the treaty. So the Czech Republic can fly over Poland if it wants to, you know, or you know, Russia can fly over Romania if it wants to, or the U.S. or whatever, you know. So it's just this kind of thing. And the U.S. claimed, and I've written about this, about how the U.S.'s claims behind its withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty are bullshit. Just like with the INF Treaty, just like with JCPOA, they claimed, oh, the other side has been violating this for a long time, you know, so we're pulling out. There is no proof that Russia has violated the Open Skies Treaty. None at all. It is a complete disaster that this has been allowed to deteriorate in the way that it has. It's just one more thing that just relaxes those tensions. But so the interesting thing is, in reading about how the U.S. thinks about this issue is basically, well, we have satellites, so we can still see whatever the fuck we want in your country. I hope it's okay for me to cuss on your podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the U.S. can see whatever it wants with all these satellites that it has. Other countries don't have those kinds of satellites to be able to see as much. Russia, of course, has its spy satellites and stuff. But the U.S. can just use its satellites to kind of spy in a one-sided capacity. You know what I mean? U.S. can get what it wants, the other side can't. So that's really now China was not a part of the Open Skies Treaty. But I think the principle is basically the same, which is that the U.S. wants to maintain its dominance over Russia in the same way it wants to maintain its dominance over China, and particularly in space. So in this case, it's the U.S. is on top of the hill and needs to defend the hill from anybody who else who wants to come up. and that means that everybody else is trying to figure out how to shoot down satellites and stuff like that, which kind of gets into what I was talking about at the beginning, which is that China and Russia have in recent years been testing out, and India too, by the way, have been testing out the ability to shoot down satellites with ground-based missiles, to supposedly have inspector satellites and things like that, jamming capacities and whatever. All of that is driven by the fact that the U.S. has this absolutely overbearing space capability, and that's a very unequal capability. And actually, the Space Force doctrine documents are correct. Everything the U.S. military does is run through space. Communications, GPS locations, guiding missiles to their targets. All this stuff runs through space. And so, if I were a country that was mismatched against the U.S. and I wanted to hit them where it really hurt, I would go for their space assets too.
Mm-hmm.
So the U.S. has kind of roped itself into this, excuse me, into this next arms race, just in the interest of defending its gains from the previous arms race.
So let's bring it up to now, if we can, and talk about the USSF, or United States Space Force, at least in its current iteration, and break down a little bit of what composes it. So one of the things you discuss in, I think, your earliest piece on this, or one of your earlier pieces from this past August, is that, quote, interstate strategic competition, unquote, trumps terrorism, quote, concerns, unquote, in the national security state. So it's no longer terrorism that is the primary concern of the national security state. It's interstate strategic competition. Can you talk about that shift?
Yeah. So the document you're talking about is the National Security Strategy Report. And I'm sorry. My throat's just very...
Don't apologize. You're fine.
Just hacking up a lung on here. Yeah, so going back to... There's a bunch of documents, a flurry of documents, December 2017 to... I'm sorry, I have to get water. Just give me 30 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, you're fine. You're fine. You're absolutely fine.
And we're back.
Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal.
So December. Oh, sorry. I'm getting an echo. I thought you were talking. So yeah, December 2017, January, February 2018, it's a bunch of documents that come out at the same time. The Nuclear Posture Review, the National Security Strategy, and stuff like that. And they outline this really big strategic shift in the U.S. It's basically saying that the war on terror, which has dominated U.S. strategic thinking since 9/11, is no longer its primary strategic concern. Now it is this, as you said, interstate strategic competition. Another document says great power competition, specifically with Russia and China, is now the primary concern of the U.S. And that's really the heart of this. That's the heart of this entire shift. Is this this idea that these campaigns against international terrorism, or groups supposedly that are terroristic, that have driven the justification behind declared wars and undeclared wars across the Middle East, and even in the Philippines and stuff, have is not really the primary threat the U.S. faces anymore. Now it's this competition from a revitalized Russia and a rising China. And that's really shifted everything from troop deployments to funding for new weapons to even diplomacy and stuff. So
and some of the language that's used by Space Force to describe what their aims are, I think, are quite revealing. For example, counter space capabilities. So implicit in that is that the US has the right to occupy and control space. And as on Earth, we're simply taking a defensive posture. And when China and Russia make moves in space, those are their counter space capabilities, not their space capabilities, because we own space. And then there's also the explicit reference to freedom of operation in space, which of course singularly applies to the US and not other countries, I would say. So it's both implicit and explicit what Space Force is trying to do. Like Misty said, it's intergalactic imperialism, and they're striving for, quote, space superiority. So can you talk more about that and the vision for 2020 that was concocted in 1997?
Yeah, and I'll warn you, I think I'm losing my voice. So
Oh.
I
Yeah,
may
we
to
have
drop
been going for like an hour and a half, so maybe we should
Yeah.
wrap here after this question.
So
So sorry, since we're gonna wrap, I'll just throw this into the question too, because I kind of wanted to give a human face to who's behind the Space Force. Can you talk about General John Raymond as well?
I can't place that person. Who's that?
He's the CSO of Space Force. John W. J. Raymond is his full name. He's mentioned in your August article.
I couldn't tell you anything unique about him.
Okay.
Top of my head, at least.
I just wanted to ask in case there was something in his dossier, so to speak, that makes him important, or to try to identify if he's pushing any of this Space Force stuff we've been talking about. But so yeah, anybody who's watching the CSO, I forget what the acronym stands for, of Space Force, is
Chief of Space Operations.
Chief of Space Operations, General John W. J. Raymond. So there's somebody to look into. But to the rest of the question about U.S. Space Command vision for 2020, can you speak to that real quick?
Yeah. So basically, the I'm really losing my ability to speak. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. The issue is defending U.S. space dominance, and that 1997 document was really just kind of laying out, like, we know that in the future we're going to have to defend this. We don't at the moment, but one day we will. And so we should figure out what that's going to look like, you know. And in ways, it's kind of a prefiguration of the Space Force. It kind of predicted very well, actually, what will the U.S.'s concerns be? How will it be challenged, and how should it go about addressing those challenges? So, and it really kind of lays out the same kind of things, like protecting our satellites and stuff like that, you know, and whatever. But yeah, you're absolutely right to bring up the I'm sorry, I've completely forgotten the question you asked. I had half an answer.
The vision for 2020?
No, before that.
Space superiority, or the general I mentioned?
Yeah, I think it was space superiority in terms of, like, the way the U.S. feels entitled to everything that it has, right? So whenever the U.S. is being dislodged from something, but it's always defensive, you know? Right. There's never, and this is the way that diplomacy really is in many respects. If you think about, like, the concept of, like, a balance of power, for example, every nation's idea of a balance of power is different, you know, because a balance of power is what keeps their interests from being actively threatened, you know. And in this case, like protecting dominance, what's defensive, what's offensive, and whatever is really a question of like of that control too. So the U.S. has seen space as its domain, not as a domain in which it entered and now controls. And now other nations, understandably also want to do so. It's its domain. We own space. And now other countries are trying to get into that, and that's a threat to the U.S. And so the U.S., even though it, of course, seized something, now the fact that somebody else wants to seize it, now it's getting defensive, and now this is a threat to it. It's a very, very, very twisted and nefarious kind of posturing.
It's the mind of a colonizer. That's what it is.
That's exactly it. It is,
it's the mind of a colonizer.
Ours, and then if you want to come along and take it from us, well, it's part of us. You know what I mean? So
yeah, and all of this is incredibly fascinating, and it's very telling to me that this isn't covered more in the media, because this seems like a very big story. This is something that is going to take, U.S. taxpayer dollars to build and to, fund and to research and all of these things. And and like I said, when Trump first, started Space Force, it was nothing more than a late night comedian's joke. It was everybody was making fun of, Donald Trump and his Space Force. But this is legitimate. This is not something that Donald Trump invented. It's been an idea for a long time. And this is really just, U.S. imperial forces asserting their power now in space. And that should be terrifying to everybody who is against U.S. imperialism, because this is just further endangering all of us, the entire globe, really. So yeah, I think that this is something that people, obviously we'll link to all of your articles, but people really need to start looking into this and really informing themselves as far as what's going on and who's running the show and what are their plans and where's the money coming from and all of those things. These are questions people really need to be asking and talking about, because I think the media will probably try to, push it under the rug a little bit, because, spending more money on defense or on military forces of any kind is going to be a hard sell right now in the United States. Like Jesse mentioned earlier, there's a pandemic and nobody has health care, and there are all of these things that we're dealing with domestically, and now they want to further extend our funding and financial backings to take over space, and that's going to be a tough sell when people can't go to the doctor. So definitely I think this is something that people need to look into for themselves. We'll link to as many articles as we can in the show notes. And yeah, just thanks for coming on and talk about this, because before we talked about doing this show. I had heard about Space Force. I kind of had like a basic understanding, but I had no idea some of the history and some of the details and nuances to this. So this has been really cool to learn about. And like you said, it is cool. Like, it's like a 9-year-old kid. You're like, oh, I get to fly a spaceship and shoot lasers. Like, that's awesome. But when you think about whose hands that power is in, it becomes a little bit more terrifying and less cool. So yeah, just thank you for coming on to talk about this. Thank you for covering it, because like I said, doesn't seem like many people are, for sure.
And what's terrifying as well is the fact that these weapons could very easily end humanity. So yeah. That's also
no big deal.
Yeah. I'm really sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about Project Thor, because that's really interesting.
Listen,
I read an article about it a couple years ago. I'll send it your way.
Okay.
We're happy to have you on anytime. Like when we had you on last time, it was so much fun. Like we were kind of all over the place, but I love that, because that's kind of how my brain works. So it's always fun for me. But yeah, anytime you want to come on to talk about anything, we're happy to have you on for sure.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to come on. I love talking to you guys.
Awesome. And I think this is a story that we're going to, that's just getting started, so to speak, even though it has a long history to it so far. There's still a lot to come, I think, and a lot to investigate and deconstruct. So thanks for spending the time you did with us, Morgan, to deconstruct what we did, and I hope your voice feels better.
Yeah, sorry.
Have you been going to protests and yelling?
Very much so.
Okay. Well,
we went down to the big, Biden won, Trump lost celebration last night, with a couple of banners and stuff about, like, really, pushing the progressive agenda beyond what Biden is really kind of talking about or even considering doing, because our concerns haven't changed. So
right.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for doing that.
Last night.
Thank you for doing that.
So, absolutely.
All right. Well, our guest today has been Morgan Artyukhina. They're a journalist with Sputnik. And as we've discussed today, they've written a series of very fascinating, very frightening, and very necessary pieces on Space Force, which is something we have not heard a lot about in the news, and we should be hearing more about. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Morgan, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Take care.